is Linda Naveja, and I'm going to come to you today with some sewing essentials. If you need to put a button on your jacket or a button on a shirt, you need to have basic sewing essentials. So that's what we're going to talk about today. The first thing you need is thread, and it doesn't really matter what kind of thread you need. What this depends on, your thread, is your thread color for your material, whatever you need to use. So that's how you choose your thread. The next thing you need is a good pair of scissors. These scissors only are used to cut material, and they're Fisker scissors, and they're pretty heavy, and they just balance in your hand, and they are Fisker. They're for cutting material only. You don't cut paper, you don't cut anything else with these scissors. They're your good scissors. You also need a good pair of small scissors to get into little tight spots so that you can just do what you have to do. There's a difference between the size. See, this point and this point, they're very different. So you need a good pair of small scissors. You also need some pins, because sometimes your material is separated, and let's say you wanted to make a tutu and you needed to pin your elastic to your tulle. So you would use pins. So you've got to have some pins, okay? And that helps hold the material together. The next thing you're going to need is a needle, and it doesn't really matter what kind of needle. They're basically all the same, but within this needle there's a hole, and that's called the eye of the needle. So you want to put your thread in that hole, and then you bring it out together, and you're going to create a knot at the end of the thread, and that's created by wrapping it around your index finger a few times, and you just pull it through, and that creates the knot. So then when you start to sew, you want to kind of hide that knot, so you would go in between the material, pull it through. Oops, I've got a lot of pins here. So you pull it through, and there you go. You start to sew. And sewing is pretty easy. It's not rocket science. It's just putting two pieces of material together. And basically that's it. So you also need, let's do this. You also need a thread, a ripper, a seam ripper. And that is to get in here. It gets in between the seam, and it begins to rip those things apart. Because sometimes, let's face it, we make mistakes. So we need to get rid of those mistakes, and as we put it in there, it just takes the thread, it tears the thread apart. There. So you have to have a good ripper, and that's all it's called. All these items can be found at Walmart, Hobby Lobby, any Joann's, wherever you sew, where they sell sewing materials, that's where you can find the item. I also like to have a thimble. The thimble just goes on your finger, because sometimes as you're sewing, the needle gets hard to push through, and this is a piece of metal, so you need a little help to push it through, and that's where your thimble comes in. So you're just going to push it through, and there you go. So you need to have a thimble. That's a good basic tool to have. I also always keep buttons. I like to have a lot of buttons. I recycle all my buttons, so before I throw away a jacket or whatever, I take the buttons off, because buttons are a little pricey. So I recycle most of my buttons. And I like to have girl buttons and boy buttons, because I have a grandson and a granddaughter. And sometimes you go and you buy some shorts, they're kind of plain, so you just jazz them up with a little bit of a button, and you make it look a little cuter with a button. A button will take you a long way. And I have colored buttons, things like that. You also need a safety pin. It's always good to have a good size safety pin, and these come in packs of maybe 50. So you want to have a safety pin because sometimes you need to push something through. Let's say that you're making a tutu and you've sewn a piece of material over like that. And so here's your seam. So what you do is you push your pin through and it comes out on the other side, bringing your elastic. I always like to keep elastic, but these are my last few remaining elastics because of course right now I've been making some masks, and these are my last few bits of elastic. So it's always good to have the basics on hand so that you can use them as you need them. This little case here is for my needles, my sewing needles. I keep them in here so I know exactly where they are. I just pick this up and when I want to do some simple sewing, I pick that up and I know I've got my needles in there. So that's it for now. We're going to come back in a little bit and show you how to do a button because the buttons are pretty simple, so we're going to come back to that.